Hi, welcome to the Townsend Center for the Humanities. I'm Rebecca Egger. I'm the executive director, and I'm really pleased to welcome Professor Sharad Chari from the Department of Geography to discuss his book, Apartheid Remains, which was published this year by Duke. And he'll be joined by Professor Jill Hart, his colleague in geography. And before they begin their conversation, I wanted to say a word about a pair of events that we're hosting next week. We'll be welcoming the Stanford art historian, Alexander Nemiroff, who is this year's UNA's lecturer. His lecture is entitled Love, Art as Awakening as Breath, and it'll take place this coming Monday, October 21st at 5 o'clock in the Maud Fife Room in Wheeler Hall. And then the following day, Tuesday, October 22nd, Professor Nemiroff will be in conversation with Elisa Tamarkin, a faculty member in English. And that event will take place here at the Townsend Center and will be followed by a reception. So I hope you can all join us next week. And with that, I'm pleased to hand things over to Sharad and Jill.
Okay, thanks so much, Rebecca. What we are going to do is we're going to start off with Sharad outlining the book. This is a big, complex book. And so what he's going to do is walk us through the structure of the book and the key arguments. And then I'm going to follow up with some reflections and questions. And then as quickly as possible, we'll move to opening up to question and discussion from the audience. So Sharad.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for coming, and thanks to Stephen and everyone at the Townsend, Rebecca, everyone at the Townsend Center for letting us do this. Jill and I have been in conversation for several decades, and Jill was also the second person to read the manuscript, which was much bigger than this, and it was a real beast. And so that was a labor of love, and I appreciate that. I appreciate actually also in a way, Jill got me into this mess. So in many moments, and so thanks, Jill. I also wanted to always begin by thanking Peter Mackenzie, whose photograph graces the cover. Late Peter Mackenzie is a photographer. I say, please judge the book by the cover, because it's very beautiful, and there's some hidden jokes in it as well. So the book is called Apartheid Remains, and I definitely don't mean that apartheid remains. I mean it as a puzzle. Whole book puzzles over how the remains of apartheid continue to are difficult to dislodge, and they continue to stymie change in various ways. They're lodged in spaces, bodies, and environments, psyches, dreams of the future, political imaginations, and yet people continue to strive for something else. That's the kind of the general theme. It's anchored in two neighborhoods stuck between oil refineries and other polluting industry, and a kind of patchwork landscape of residence and industry that is also stuck in a little valley that traps pollution in the Indian Ocean city of Durban in South Africa, and it focuses even more particularly on what was and still is largely an Indian neighborhood called Merebank, and what was and still is largely a colored mixed race neighborhood called Wentworth, and what seem like apartheid townships with settled forms of racialization of people and territory. The book tries to subvert or uncover as through complex histories of unfree labor, forced movement, also conviviality and placemaking. So what seem like different things are part of connected spatial histories. In a nutshell, Merebank was part of a post-indenture landscape of peasant workers surrounding the city who had subverted and transformed what was hoped to be a white city, and has a long history of civic mobilization, that is community-based organization in the neighborhood. And Wentworth is a place where multiple trajectories of people come together in a place when they were classified, when the place and people were classified colored, and where they shared little else except histories of precarious tenancy, labor, and movement. So this comparison of these two places, Wentworth and the Mirror of Merebank, becomes a device to then look across the 20th century at remains of racial statecraft, racial capitalism, and struggle. When the neighborhoods are portals into this broader account. So the book is divided into two parts. Part one is called Racial Palimpsest, and it focuses on on moments from the 1900s to the 1970s. In a way, there's an argument, methodological argument about thinking palimpsestically about a landscape in which objects are not all in the present tense, and uses artifacts from the present to circuit back to the past and then return to the present. And this is part of a method that I think of as useful for thinking about racial capital. The term racial capitalism presumes that the present is bolstered by older forms of authority and privilege. And so this is a kind of method for thinking about past and present. And also a more general methodological claim is that geography can be thought of as a kind of history of the present. So part one, from the 1900s to the 1970s, when apartheid capitalism enters a period of intractable political and economic crisis, and the argument across this swath of time, one thing stands out is that the racial state constantly tried to transform people and places, but with very little knowledge about what was happening on the ground. It's a form of power without knowledge, as my friend and colleague in South Africa, Heath Breckenridge, puts it. But there are particular forms of knowledge that become particularly efficacious, forms of biopolitical expertise, new forms of expert knowledge in the early 20th century that we know of as public health, urban planning, social work, later on social medicine, environmental planning even later on. Expertise meant to transform people and places into governable subjects and landscapes of segregation and apartheid, except that the state acted as if it knew what it was doing, while instead generating the grounds of struggle in new forms, including struggle over on the terrain of biopolitics itself, as Black people turn to social work, public health, urban planning, environmentalism, and so on, as tools of struggle against segregation, racial capitalism at various moments before, during, and after apartheid. So the book, I'm just going to just mention a few arguments from that first part. The first chapter, the book begins really with Anglo-Boer concentration camps, which is a strange and interesting beginning, but it's a site in which at which forms of biopolitical expertise enter this landscape, and then in the that turns through memories from these neighborhoods today to landscapes of the past, imagined landscapes of the past, and to what happens in early 20th century Durban and its peripheries and interstices when subalterns, particularly post-indenture, so the peripheries of Durban, plantation landscape, part of the global plantation belt, Indian indentured labor brought from British India to this landscape. Those figures now in a mixed Black periphery and interstices of the city literally root themselves in the landscape by planting Indian vegetables and fruits and transforming the landscape in ways that the city doesn't notice, because the city is obsessed with the city center, where an Indian mercantile class is beautifying the city and creating these beautiful Art Deco facades that are actually, and the city hall is pissed off that it's this Indian mercantile class that's doing it. So it's actually, its ire is focused there and on African exclusion as well. And here in between these dynamics is this process of space making, a subaltern process of space making that is still edible, audible, tangible in every way in Durban as a kind of Indian Durban. And it's a kind of second city that is, and it's not just a sort of Indian thing either. I think the greatest victory of the Durban working class is a market in the middle of the city where Black women transact, informal traders transact right in the heart of the city. And that's a product of this subaltern history of space making. So, and then the next chapters turn to the would-be local states' progressivism and industrialization, which folds in very nicely into its projects of segregation. But and because it knows very little about what's going on the ground, this is a chaotic process. It produces more, more sites of struggle. But what's interesting is this landscape becomes productive of this field of social medicine, which emerges, in rural Natal and KwaZulu at that time, and also in these neighborhoods in Durban. And I read the transition to apartheid as an attempt at racial spatial fix of the contradictions of capital, that instead it's also a kind of attempt at building a science fiction reality of forced estrangement that doesn't actually work, in that people continue to build forms of conviviality that are not quite what apartheid imagined. There's a particular kind of tale told in South Africa about places that were lost to apartheid, places of conviviality, of football and jazz and politics that were lost in apartheid's forced removals. These places are actually created as a product of apartheid, so there's some difficulty around telling stories about these places. Part two is called Remains of Revolution. It's about the revolution that was and wasn't, depending on where you look and how. And it's about the multiple strands of the anti-apartheid movement as it coursed through this landscape, recruiting people and place it differently. So one chapter, the first in this sequence, is about a communitarian strand. It's some way my favorite chapter. It's a reinterpretation of the incredible political effervescence in the early 70s in Durban. It's called the Durban moment, popularly, when Steve Biko was a resident in Wentworth, and next to the oil refinery that I mentioned. Multiple things happening in this moment: a dock worker strike, black worker strikes across the city, students in solidarity with these strikes, and Black consciousness movement emerging through this. I think of it in Benjaminian terms as a theological political moment, where some young people take a leap of political faith in the hope of fundamentally transforming personhood and space through political blackness. I also read it through Butler's reading of the political theological fragment as one time traversing another. If you know that piece, it's, I think, a beautiful reading, and it also helps me interpret this moment. While some young people are drawn to Black consciousness, others were drawn to the moment of insurrection through the mythology of armed struggle, which took some people to exile, to a thicket of intrigue and infiltration. But also, it created a web of supporters in the neighborhood of Merebank, a web that anticipated a long critique within the external mission, the exiled ANC and South African Communist Party, of its idea of armed struggle through remote control, and initially a notion of agrarian armed struggle without agrarian mobilization, something that Jill has written about as well, thought about. And the external mission had to come to terms with the fact that it had very little to do with the internal struggles of the 1970s, the Durban moment, the dock worker strike, the independent Black trade unions, the student uprisings, community struggles, and so on. And that led to the third of this in the sequence, I call it the moment of urban revolution, that tried to bring the communitarian and insurrectionist strands together in a concerted, coordinated urban struggle that held the possibility of the ANC's return as a hegemonic force to come. And this moment had its powerful workerist and feminist critics of vanguardism. And it also included people who were drawn, that web-like structure in Merebank anticipated some of this, and some people were drawn into a very interesting and perhaps one of the external mission's most exciting operations called Operation Bula, which brought in materiel for People's War, but also kind of a new kind of communication system, a proto-internet communications linking Mandela in prison with figures in exile the President Oliver Tambo and through London. It's quite a feat. But there's also this urban movement also drew in planners and geographers and medical experts and all sorts of people into the urban movement that opened the possibility of radical determination of urban life. And that was not to be, which takes me to the final moment, which is the urban movement was not actually built on a lived anti-authoritarianism. And that takes me to what I call the moment of the disqualified, the experience of those who were in many ways left behind by the urban movement, but who had particularly compelling ways of looking into the wounds of racial segregation and apartheid in a way that others did not. And this strand, it included both saboteurs and one particular cell which never made the transition from terrorists to struggle heroes. They're still vilified for their acts, and also photographers who said they picked up the camera rather than an AK-47 as using the visual as a form of critique. The book is actually bookended by photography and by the work of these documentary photographers of the 1980s and their forms of critique as a narrative arc through the book in which the visual initially they're forgeries of Black life in Cedric Robinson's terms, and then photography is another progressivist tradition actually that Black political photographers turn these tools into instruments of struggle, and the photography becomes part of the means of critique. And another final thread I'd say is that another red thread running through the book is the struggles of non-gender normative women who were crucial to these, what I call the biopolitical struggles in the, when the struggle turns to the biopolitical struggles. The foot soldiers and have been people engaged in social work, nursing, community development, and so on. Things you don't normally think of as particularly radical, but were a part of this broader terrain of biopolitical struggle. So that's the kind of arc of the book. And then the last thing I'll say is that it's literally at the confluence of the Black Atlantic and the Indian Ocean, and that's part of the energy that I think drives what the book tries to tell the story.
Great. Thanks, Sharad. Thanks so much. So, and Sharad has said, and I think it's wonderfully appropriate, that the book is actually a love letter to Durban. And Sharad and I share a very deep love of Durban. And I left South Africa in 1971, came back for the first time in 1990. And traveling around to Johannesburg, Cape Town, and Durban, very quickly came to realize that Durban was by far the most vibrant, exciting, politically, intellectually engaged region of South Africa. And so I kind of planted some roots in Durban. It was, and one of the things that's so wonderful about Apartheid Remains is that it explains to me in many ways what it is that was so compelling to me about Durban. And partly, I think it's the remains of the Durban moment that Sharad was talking about, which started in 1972 with the dock workers' strike, very quickly led to strikes, major strikes in factories all over Durban, but was also deeply linked to the Black consciousness movement. And Steve Biko and a very extraordinary group of people around him who then connected with a group of people who include dear friends of both of us in Merebank. But also its ongoing reverberations. And the 1980s, there was some incredibly creative political activism that went on in Durban. Partly also what makes Durban special is where Sharad ended. It's the confluence of the Black Atlantic and the Indian Ocean. And it's also the coming together of Africa and India, but also other parts of Asia, remembering that slavery in the Cape was really enslaved people were brought from what was then the Netherlands Indies by the Dutch. So this whole sort of eastern coast of South Africa is very deeply connected with different regions of Asia. And, you know, Apartheid Remains is actually a magnificent homage to Durban and to the extraordinary group of activists who really just spring to life in the book. You really, even though I know some of them, the ones I don't know, I felt I got to know through the book. And I think that's one of its great strengths. It's incredibly rich and deeply layered. And there really is, tons has been written about Durban. There's nothing like this book in terms of the ethnographic and historical depth. And it both demands and deserves very careful reading, as you can see. A forest. And for me, it's been very exciting to watch the book evolve, although really a lot of the time somewhat at a distance. My last really close encounter with the book was in 2016, when I read a big first draft. Took me a week to read that first draft. But I was entranced by it, but it was also clear that it was going to be, a brick. And the danger of that is you lose readers. And I remember Sharad and I went for a walk in which we talked about, should it be one book or two? And his decision, in some ways, making it into two books would have been the easy out. He took the far more difficult path of condensing it into one book, which has involved cutting out huge amounts of stuff. And believe me, this is beautifully written, careful text. Throwing this out is excruciatingly painful. I can see faces rather acknowledging that. But I think he's really done this in a very powerful way. And, I've been struck in sort of coming back to, and this is a book you can't just skim, in coming back to a close, careful read and trying to recall. I left my notes in South Africa, but, I have at least some memories of what the draft looked like. And it seems to me that I want to just highlight some of the things I think Sharad has accomplished in this major rewriting. Firstly, is the absolute imperative to go back to the era before apartheid in 1948. And I think it's hugely important that he begins the book with the Anglo-Boer War and the concentration camps in Merebank and Wentworth. And of course, there were concentration camps all over South Africa where the Brits held mainly Boer women and children, but also Africans were also held in concentration camps. And to understand its resonances in the present. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the vital importance of recognizing segregation, the era of segregation. So the other thing that's become much more central in this rewriting is the concept of biopolitical struggle, where Sharad moves beyond a narrow concept of biopolitics to what I think is a very vibrant, dynamic, processual understanding of biopolitical struggle as an ongoing process. And this is really important because it operates to tie the two pieces of the book together, I think, very tightly. And it's a powerful thread that runs through the book and sort of holds it together. A third element that is much more fully developed, I think, in my memory, much more fully developed, is the focus on Black Marxist feminism. And not only were non-normative people involved in gender, involved in the everyday struggles around biopolitics. But also, I think there's a very important paragraph where he says, radical anti-capitalist, anti-patriarchal, and anti-racist critique pushes beyond the ruse of a biopolitical resolution to racial capitalist crises. And I think this is hugely important. And again, I want to come back to this. And then the photographs at the beginning and the end are part of what makes this really special. And I don't think the photographic part was nearly as developed in that early draft, but it's both the photographers and the photographers as activists who are a product of Wentworth and its dynamic relations. It's impossible to even begin to do justice to the book in this short time. So what I'm going to do is just highlight and really just elaborate a little on points I've just made, and then end with some questions that we might sort of pick up. So first of all, the emphasis on segregation in relation to progressivism is hugely significant, because what it underscores is segregation as a quintessentially liberal progressive project. And the key arguments of white supremacist forms of rule in South Africa in the first half of the 20th century were not racist Afrikaners. They were bloody Brits, proponents of progressive forms of liberalism with tight connections to the US. And thinking about progressivism in South Africa in relation to the US forces attention to the racist dimensions of progressivism, which in much writing on US progressivism falls out of sight. So this is one of the instances in which this kind of attention to what was going on in South Africa opens out to connections in other regions of the world. Lord Alfred Milner, the High Commissioner in South Africa, in his so-called kindergarten, were very closely tied with key progressivist forces in the UK as well as in the US. In the immediate post-Anglo-Boer War period, what they were primarily concerned with was Black political uprising. And what they worked towards and the way they used segregation was to try to forge alliances with Boers and Brits who'd been at war in the end of the 19th century. In order, and they very explicitly and often use the term Black peril, and they saw this white alliance as crucial in confronting the Black peril, particularly given the political exclusion of Black South Africans from the settlement that produced the Union of South Africa. In the post-World War I period, when there were major uprisings, especially among the Black population, segregation was really intensified. So in other words, the whole question of South Africa and the centrality of racism to segregation and the way they all tie together, I think is hugely important. And that part of what is so powerful about the book is we can see how what the Apartheid Remains have long, deep roots that need to be disinterred, I think, if we're going to move towards any kind of different future. So, you know, a very key contribution that Sharad has made is to tie segregation to biopolitical struggle, and very precisely to specific forms of segregation focusing on the municipal level. So there's been a lot written about segregation, progressivism more generally, but he gives us the most finely grained understanding. And I want to read here a paragraph from the book because he's taking on the question, what would it have meant to bring in a Black township into the state? And he makes the argument that there not only would it have, expanded enormously the project, but he has a paragraph that I think is very powerful. He says the specificity of Wentworth and Merebank is that these racial and spatial borderlands constituted a zone of experimentation in biopolitical statecraft and struggle, including the global circulation of social medicine and environmental justice. African townships were subject to brutal repression rather than the kind of biopolitical concern and intervention meted out to intermediate racial groups. And I think that's very important, and it applies to the era of segregation as much as to the era of apartheid. But I would argue that the sort of insights that one gets from the way in which he's used biopolitical struggle in relation to municipal forms of governance applies as well to the later period of apartheid in the kinds of townships I worked in former Bantustans, where in fact I would argue that precisely forms of biopolitical intervention were undertaken by the apartheid state and also generated intense contradictions that erupted precisely in the social movements that we saw that rose to the fore in the late 1990s, early 2000s. I want to end though by pointing to, and I'm gone on too long, but pointing to what seems to me something of a tension though, that I'm with, which Sharad and I have talked a little bit, but I'd like to just sort of lay out. It seems to me that running through the book, there's a tension between, on the one hand, a quite precise understanding of biopolitical struggle at the municipal level, sort of around questions of public health, urban planning, social welfare, later on environmental struggles. But there are also moments through the book where it seems to me Sharad is deploying a much broader, more capacious understanding of biopolitical struggle. So for instance, on page 218, where he's talking about the Durban moment, he said, through these twists and turns, the Durban moment was becoming much more than a worker uprising. I call it a biopolitical uprising, fueled by a conjunctural potion of ecumenical Christianity, worker unrest, Black consciousness thought, and the utopianism of youth. And the question I have for Sharad is, what are the implications politically? And here specifically going back to Black Marxist feminist forms of anti-racism and anti-patriarchy, anti-capitalist struggles, exemplified by the Combahee River Collective, which very much used this analysis around a politics of coalition. And I guess for me, the question that I'll just pose is, what are the implications of the narrower as opposed to the more capacious conception of biopolitical struggle in relation to the broader political possibilities that the sort of analysis that you've given us opens up? So I'll stop there and open up.
Thank you, Jill. That's amazing. I'll be brief in my response. Just to say, I appreciate all that you've said, and I'll just pick up on the last point. That's okay. Well, there are a couple of aspects to it. So I hate writing theory sections. They're so painful. And they kind of put the cart before the horse, even though we can't do that and all that. And I did it. I had to do it. I had to do it. I thought, we're free of this, but I sort of did it. And that's when I wrote this section on, this is what I'm, we can't imagine it, but we have to imagine it. Black Marxist feminism. We don't, despite all the broken solidarities that this and theoretical impossibilities that it seems to provoke. And also, just importantly, that that the material I'm diagnosing involves people who don't a small group of people who identify as Black, not Indian or colored, in this moment of a coalitional Black politics, and that has its life, it rises and falls. It has its forms of innocence, as Stuart Hall put it. So it has its lifetime. The feminist critique is of movements that are almost willfully masculinist, in fact. But that's when it matters, actually, right? And the Marxism is also in a coalitional politics that often leaves the working class behind. So so it's sort of Black Marxist feminist, not in identitarian terms, really, as a kind of political thread. And then turning to what happens when the tools of biopolitics, I use that language from Keith Breckenridge, taking apart biopolitics into these instruments, forms of expertise, deployed with various intentions, usually belied, but nonetheless part of what we have to analyze. They don't actually transform subjects and territories and places in the ways that Foucault may have hoped, but actually that's when Foucault is interesting, I think, from a Marxist perspective. And they still become instruments of racism, as state racism, as he so presciently put it. So biopolitical struggle, people don't go willingly. Instruments of state racism become part of the terrain of anti-racist struggle, which is also it's caught in this mesh of power, and there are no certainties about which directions it takes. The politics of biopolitical struggle are quite open. We've talked about the experts in social medicine from this landscape flee at the moment of onset of apartheid, and where do they go? The new state of Israel. That's where they go to deepen the story of social medicine. These figures, the Cox. So there are no. I think that that biopolitics has no intrinsic politics, although I think Foucault is pretty much right that when it becomes an instrument of sovereignty, and also he has an insight in history of sexuality when it becomes a tool of capitalism, it lends itself to a kind of state racism. But that's the beginning of an analysis. And so biopolitical struggle can reinforce. It can be about fixing capitalism, as Ruthie Gilmore says, saving capital from itself. But it can also mean something else. It can become and that's what I think is emergent in the moments that you point out. But that's what I try to point out. I also struggle with this in the book, with the limits of biopolitical struggle, because I mean that urban movement is an example of when there is something that is emergent that is quickly foreclosed, and then there are these figures who actually see the limits, I think, of this expertise, who are so excluded from it, even though they may have come into politics also through social work and so on. I'm being a bit cryptic, but there are various limits in the material as well. I think it's still something for me that's something that we cannot give up on. The idea of seizing the means of seizing the means of expertise around conditions of life, the possibility of life. That's sort of that's where the politics of the book ends. I don't know if it's what you would label it, but it is a kind of maybe crypto-Marxist, Foucauldian anarchist feminism.
Okay, thanks, Sharad. So why don't we open up to questions? Oh, wait.
Tell us your name for the recording as well.
My name?
Yeah. go
Oh,
ahead,
okay.
because it-
My name is Zamanze Lenzele, and I am from South Africa, from KwaZulu-Natal, in fact. So my question is very broad. And as you know, that South Africa has the highest inequality gap. The wealth inequality in South Africa is the highest on earth. As a direct result from the social and economic and spatial architecture of apartheid. And so, in fact, this is a very stark contradiction and fundamental feature of post-apartheid South Africa. And I'm just wondering how you navigate that contradiction in your book.
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you. I don't actually study those extremes really. I sort of study them this sort of a kind of middle border race class borderline areas in the race class spectrum of the city. So I don't have an answer. I don't study that here. And I study those groups because I think, because they are, as Jill pointed out in my quotation she read, they tell us a certain story, but they don't tell us the story of deepening inequality since apartheid, unfortunately.
Hi, I'm Holomi Saha. Sharad, thank you. Jill, thank you. This was really interesting. And I'm going to ask a question, which I suspect the answer is maybe your next book, but I'm going to ask it anyway, which is I'm so taken by your reorienting our attention to Durban as you put it, the confluence between the Black Atlantic and the Indian Ocean. And it's a kind of radical reorienting that I'm still working through in my own mind, but I'm wondering if you could tell me what that does for the stories of racial capital and imperial forms that we have inherited from these two sites as never fully separate, but not usually thought of as having a or many sites of confluence in the way that you're placing Durban. So how does Durban change the stories that we have about racial capital and imperial forms?
Thank you. That is something that I worked through in this book. So I have to cite the text that really blew open my mind around South Africa in a particular way, which is a scholar, poet, and Habiba Badroun, whose Habiba's book on Cape Town, actually, it's about taking apart this coloredness and the colored question, and pointing to the long histories. Jill mentioned the long histories of Indian Ocean slavery and the gendered aspect of that too, as part of an explanation around gender inequality, of one aspect of what you mentioned, Zama. But I tried to think about the form of her argument in relation to this Indian question in Durban, and to open up the Indian and colored question, in fact, in Durban. One of the big issues in South Africa, in the possibility of a post-apartheid scholarship, is to try to not reinforce these forms, right? To read their power rather than their truth, right? And so the attempt that what Habiba's work helped me think about was about, as she puts it, the repression of the Indian Ocean. And then I say these things, I know that I should have read more Freud before finishing this book. But the Indian Ocean, the repression of Indian Ocean past in this entire social formation, and they surfaced in this totally amazing and unexpected way in the fact that this is an Afro-Asian city, and that the city hall is so obsessed with the form of the city that it just doesn't notice this I think of as a second city emerging in the interstices, and transforming the food system, and that's part of this. That's an Indian Ocean history. That's the Indian Ocean shoaled in this on these shores. When it comes to the political, to political questions, the citations are to the Black Atlantic, they're to the charisma of the U.S., within the Black Atlantic even more, and the Black consciousness movement and so on, which is an Afro-Asian movement as well. Its citations are concertedly in Black power, and there's something there that is repressed in this social formation and its political and cultural forms, and it returns in all sorts of ways. And so that is part of the puzzle and also the beauty of this particular city, Durban, which is going through harder times now, but it still has this particular energy. And I'll say one last thing. My favorite name for South Africa is Xhosa. It's Umzansi, which comes from Umzansi, which means the South. And this idea of a place calling itself the South, which is quite amazing. And it's also this Eurasian African, oceanic conjuncture that makes this possible. So there's some poetry there that I'm also, thinking with. Leosha.
Thank you so much. One phrase you used in conversation earlier was the lost spaces of conviviality.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about that, and I wanted to ask you about your thinking about that along two kind of lines. One is what I would think of as a more ethnographic, backward-looking lens on like the feeling of history, the affective dimensions of a representation of the past and the politics of the present.
Yeah.
And I'm also fascinated by your attention more to the built environment and the material traces, the way in which the past remains. Sorry, this echoes the title of your book, the way in which it's not just lost spaces of conviviality that are an object for nostalgia in the present, but also lost spaces, like spaces that might continue to exist, have a first or second city. So yeah, I'm sure this is something I should read the whole book to get an answer to, but I'd love to hear more about how you're thinking around both the nostalgic and the built remains of these
Thanks, Leosha. That's also a key concern. Is a critical nostalgia possible? Is that, what is the critique of nostalgia itself in this, in reading memory and thinking? Well, most of the majority of the evidence in the book is, like everything I could possibly read from the archives of the state from 1900 to the 70s, and then a mass of oral histories. So there's a lot of this sort of, thinking with and thinking. So that is a question for me, and particularly around the pathos of these places as places produced by apartheid, that then become really quite dynamic. And there's a kind, there's another thing, which is the Indian neighborhood, because of this dispersed kind of second city that I mentioned. There's some, it's always connected to this dispersed geography of something imagined as Indian Durban. At one point, the largest population of people from the South Asian subcontinent outside before London takes over. So has that kind of, and there are all sorts of ways to authenticate a certain kind of nostalgia for this other place called India, which these people ironically have been dispossessed by. There's a moment in which the Indian nationalists kind of can't be bothered with their working class diasporas, and they kind of turn around and leave. They let them do their own thing, and that's when they root themselves in place in a particular way. This colored neighborhood presents a different kind of engagement with this question, a different kind of critical attitude with respect to the question. There's no consolations around nostalgia in that neighborhood, because what they share, as I said, what they really share is loss and temporariness, it's something much, which is why, you know, actually the forms of politics that emerge from them also are not so easily reconciled with what I'm calling this possibility of biopolitical struggle. They're much more radical, actually. So that this is a question that the subjects in this book are wrestling with.
You know, I just want to add, there's a wonderful moment in the book where Sharad engages, on the one hand, Thomas Blom Hansen, who's written a book about nostalgia in Durban, and also Jacob Dlamini's incredible book, Native Nostalgia, about Katlehong Township. And he sort of brings them into conversation with one another and then brings in his own work. And I think it's just a fascinating few pages on the whole question of nostalgia. That's very rich. Guys, it's 1 o'clock. I've been told we have to end on the nose at 1, but Sharad and I can hang around for a bit.
I'm
So
giving my
you-
students a midterm right now, actually. Unfortunately, I'm that
you
kind
can't
of
hang out
status.
too much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.